Hi, everyone. In the interest of time, we're going to get started just to make sure that we give Joel and Kat all the time that we can for them and to address questions at the end. So good morning. I'm Christy Adelman-Ritter here with Emily Maras. We are from the Connect and Communicate Series Planning Committee. Thank you for joining us for the Connect and Communicate series presenting A Wolf in Sheep's Clothing, Genre Blurring and Fake News. This discussion is being recorded and it will be made available to Pennsylvania Library Association College and Research Division members through the PALA website, as well as sent to registrants and available on the CRD blog. For this discussion, you'll only need a headset or speakers. We encourage you to ask questions in the chat box at the bottom right throughout the discussion, and we'll attempt to include your questions as appropriate during the discussion or at the end. We'll also do our best to assist participants with technical issues. Please post those issues in the chat box as well. This session is brought to you by the Pennsylvania Library Association College and Research Division's Connect and Communicate series. I'd like to thank the CRD board for supporting the Connect and Communicate initiative and the other Connect and Communicate Planning Committee members, including Ronalise Ocho, Sarah Pike, Diane Porterfield, and Amy Snyder. Please contact any of the team for information about becoming a PALA member. This project is made possible by a grant from the Institute of Museum and Library Services as administered by the Pennsylvania Department of Education through the Office of Commonwealth Libraries and the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, Tom Wolf, Governor. And finally, I'd like to thank and introduce our presenters for today's event. Kat Phillips is the Nursing and Allied Health Librarian at Penn State's University Park campus. She works with the College of Nursing, Department of Health Policy and Administration, and Consortium to Combat Substance Abuse. Her research interests focus on bias information literacy related to health policy and allied health education, working with distance graduate students, and gray literature use and education. Joel Burkholder is the reference and instruction librarian at Penn State's York campus. His research interests include the intersection between rhetoric and information literacy, the identification and evaluation of bias, and the visibility of library maintenance practices. And with all that said, I'd like to welcome Kat and Joel and turn the presentation over to them.
Thank you very much, Christy and Emily. Good morning. Welcome to A Wolf in Sheep's Clothing, Genre Blurring and Fake News. That was a really lovely introduction. I don't think we need to say a lot more beyond that, but do please feel free to contact us at any time. Our email addresses and our Twitter handles are listed here. So we would love for anybody to reach out to us. A little bit of housekeeping. We are going to have this be about as interactive as we can today. So this is more of a workshop than it is, us talking at you throughout the next hour. So we will be having everybody open up, some screens. We're going to use Padlet. We're going to have you look at some resources and kind of apply what we're talking about today. So let me get this to. Ha, hooray, it worked. So we are going to focus today on how misinformation and disinformation borrow rhetorical techniques, and what does this mean when we look at evidence and we are assessing information. This is an outgrowth of our chapter in teaching about fake news. Joel and I are doing research on how to conceptualize the concept of bias, and in order to achieve these outcomes, like I said, you're going to want to open an extra page or extra pages in your browser at some point. We do intend to introduce everybody to If I Apply if you have not been introduced to it before, because this entire session doesn't talk about If I Apply. It's going to be a pretty speedy go through, but you are welcome to contact me about If I Apply, and I have additional resources that I can drop into the chat at any point in time. So without further ado, we're actually going to jump into our first activity. This is all about bias and all about rhetoric. So what we would like everybody to do is, in a moment, I'm going to share my screen and I'm going to bring up the site that we're about to show you, which is an InfoWars. It is a Wayback Machine screen capture of InfoWars. So I'm going to scroll slowly through. We're also going to drop the link in the chat here in just a moment so that you can open it if you wish. However, it does take quite some time to open, so we wanted to make sure that you had this information for you. So I'm going to go ahead and switch screens. Joel, if you want to drop the link and the Padlet link into chat, that would be lovely. Sure. If you have those. Thank you. No rush. So here's the InfoWars Wayback Machine, and its supermoon effect on earthquake dismissed despite history. So really what we would like for you to do is answer the question, why or why not is this source news? Joel has just posted the InfoWars in chat. And then in Padlet, what specific features suggest that the source is news?
Hold on.
Take your time.
I got too many windows open.
And in a moment, I'm going to scroll through this so we can start. And there's the Padlet link as well. Thank you.
So as you're looking at it, just what we want you to focus on, I'm not going to say what to look at, but what we really want you to think about is what parts of this InfoWars article make it appear news-like. Okay. So just look at this and what parts of this make it appear to make it seem like it's news.
Thank you, Karen, for posting that. If you wanted to also post that in Padlet, that would be lovely. Thank you, Kim, as well. Okay, we have about 1 more minute to look at this. So I'm going to go ahead and start scrolling back up so we can look at it from the bottom to the top. Thank you, Laura, as well. I see we have some of the responses coming in through chat, and I know that they're coming in through Padlet as well. So I am going to go ahead and pull our PowerPoint back up because we are going to come back to this in just a little bit. So for anybody who would like to take a little bit more time as we talk about our next couple of points, you can feel free to continue to post things in Padlet, and we're going to come back to that Padlet screen in just a little bit. So it's really important to think about, what resources do librarians tend to have access to? What do we stress? What do we really like to share with our patrons, with our students if we're at a public library? People are coming in if we're in a medical library, patients or doctors. And I think it's really important to remember that libraries typically have high quality journalism and high quality content. That's not to say that 100% of the materials that libraries contain within their walls will be high quality. But if you look at these and you see 2 of these 3 resources say ask the experts, the how to spot fake news and 5 ways to spot fake news don't get taken in. And these resources are really lovely, right? They have a lot of information to distinguish between real and fake, some things to look at. When you're trying to assess evidence or assess information, but there is a baseline to be set for high quality of journalism or content that should be evaluated against. What constructs this baseline? These resources, these infographics, these, these tools and this help really assumes that people have an understanding of what that baseline is. What is the process behind how news and how information is created? And what they don't do is they don't establish an evaluative process for looking at the purpose behind news and looking at how news is produced. So all of these are built on the assumption and created on the assumption that people understand the process and creation of news. And when we have people compare to a process they don't understand, that has the potential to render the task meaningless. So, part of what Joel and I research and part of the conversations that we've had, and the reason that we put the presentation together is in part because we feel that checklists, things like the CRAAP test, other resources that are really like straight up checklists, grossly oversimplify the process. And we don't often teach that aspect of news literacy as part of our assessment of information, if we're looking at things like fake news, and asking learners to compare to a baseline that they don't quite understand or don't necessarily know. And this is why we have lots of issues, that we have issues, our patrons have issues of really assessing this information. And this is where genre blurring, that overlay of, taking the standards in that baseline and applying it then to misinformation, disinformation, misleading information, and fake news comes into play.
All right, so what we're going to do, we're going to just sort of give you some of the basics of rhetorical theory, how the genre blurring works, and then we'll revisit the InfoWars article again to sort of look at it from the perspective of the choices that are being made in order to sort of manipulate the audience's reactions to it, before we then go into If I Apply and analyze how our own personal biases or any evaluator's personal biases can influence the way that you evaluate any piece of information. So one of the things that I have felt that a lot of the checklists don't do is they don't really analyze sort of the underlying purpose, the reason, the process behind why fake news would try and adapt the conventions of news. There's a reason behind it, and so what we've really tried to think about and teased out, particularly in our teaching fake news chapter, is exactly how does that process occur. So this idea of genre blurring is not new. There are, what it's helpful to think about in genre is not as a container, but as a sort of as a mode of communication that people use whenever there's a situation that needs sort of a common response to, genres adapt in order to facilitate communication between people. So genres borrow and adapt the things from each other all the time. Think of a Wikipedia entry and the Encyclopedia Britannica. Wikipedia borrowed from Britannica to gain some of its credibility, and now Britannica is borrowing formatting from Wikipedia, so people are comfortable with the way the information is laid out, and they're interfacing it with in some ways. Genre blurring is not new, but in terms of fake news, what we want to look at is how the conventions of news are being borrowed to really gain perceptions of authority and credibility. And I think one of the interesting is that how difficult it was for us to actually find a decent example to use today. We looked all hard to try and find good stuff. And then I thought, well, I've used this InfoWars article in the past. Let's use that. InfoWars recently redesigned their page, and all of that old content is now gone. It just redirects to slickly produced videos. And so we use the archive.org example, but the challenge, I think, is that's also the sort of ephemeral nature of fake news is part of the challenge, because all it needs to do is fool somebody into sharing it via social media, have somebody read the headline and think that they've now understand the entire issue. All it needs to do that is for the briefest of moments. It needs to overcome any barriers of credulity so it can be shared. And then once it's been shared, you know, the lie can travel around the world before the truth can be even put on its pants. And once it's done that, then what you have is mission accomplished, and then that thing disappears. But the challenge though is that it's doing that via borrowing these particular conventions and manipulating them in ways to achieve their own ends. But before we get to that, I do want to give you a little bit of a primer on rhetoric, just in case. I don't know how familiar with all of you are, but just to give you a little primer of what that involves. So if you can go to the next slide, Kat.
Yep. Yep.
So this is the rhetorical situation. And what I really want you to look at is this idea of purpose, and not that these things, checklists tend to assume that these things are simply part of a product. What this is helping us understand is why those things are, why those elements are part of the source to begin with. So quickly, there are 4 parts of the rhetorical situation. There's the purpose, what it is that you want to do, the author who is creating the thing, the audience, who is the target or intended audience of this, and in what context is this information taking place. All of those things are interdependent. So if you want to achieve a specific purpose, you either have to have specific credentials that influence that audience, but you'll then also have to realize that these things are taking place in a specific context. Another the example I always used to use in class is prior to 9/11, when you were told to take your shoes off before when you went through security, that message was somewhat, what? Now we take our shoes off. So context has a complicated role in playing with ways that the way something is created, on top of the way all of these things interact. So let's go back to news and the situations that news address. News is largely to report on current events in an objective, fact-based manner, with the object of trying to create an informed citizenry, right? That is how it is designed to do. That's its main purpose. And as a result, conventions have developed in order to facilitate that kinds of communication. So it's not a mistake that fake news borrows the structure, borrows the sort of diction, it borrows the general format of an article, title, image, byline. It borrows all of those things, but it borrows them for specific purposes. Now, the difference is that it is not addressing the same situation, right? The situation is to mislead, to muddy the water, whatever the case may be. It is not addressing the same situation. So therefore, the conventions are not, they don't mean the same thing. They don't carry the same weight. So let's quickly just look at the general purposes of journalism, ethical journalism, then the conventions that have developed to sort of support that. And then we're going to look at a couple of examples beyond fake news, because this is really a larger problem than fake news itself, which I think we need to stop necessarily focusing on intentionally fabricated information and look at the entire gamut of disinformation that utilizes these techniques. So quickly, you look at the elements of journalism. In essence, there's the purpose here is dedication to the truth, to do so, to report information in an objective manner. There's a public responsibility, a watchdog function, but all of these things are what are sort of the hallmarks of ethical journalism. These are the ones that aren't necessary. I want to be clear. These are the I'm sort of setting this apart as those organizations that follow guidelines set forth that are designed to provide the sort of the fourth estate function of the media. We can talk beyond the sort of the realm of this. We can talk about how a lot of partisan media manipulates and twists this to its own ends, but that's a completely different discussion, and we're not going to go there at the moment, though it is one that is definitely worth having. We could also talk about how sort of profit-driven motives influence the way items are selected and covered and presented to the public. But ideally, in the most ideal circumstance, and this is often, I think, what we are teaching, and this is the baseline of a lot of checklists, is this idea that ideally journalism is based in this sort of public good function, right? And so as a result, conventions have developed as a means of supporting that. So if you can go to the next slide. Oh, do we miss the conventions, the all right, let's so before we get to this, there are a number of things that have developed, particularly, say, Reuters. There's things about how if somebody gets it wrong, you issue a correction. There are guidelines in terms of how you source information, right? You try to get a named source as opposed to unnamed source. Anonymous sources should be avoided. There should never be an intent to deliberately mislead. There's a whole bunch of things. Things should reflect reality as closely as they can. So word choice should be more neutral in respects that there should be datelines and bylines. So you do put names to articles that are created. You date them so people know where this is reporting in the larger context of events. You offer attribution. You do all of these things to try to get a sense of these things guide the journalist's behavior in order to achieve those. So this is an image from the website First Draft, and it looks at different types of misinformation, disinformation. Quickly, the author of this article defines this as misinformation as stuff that is not shared, but not shared by accident. Information that is not necessarily is incorrect, false, but it is shared by accident. So somebody posts something on Facebook or on Twitter, and you, using that sort of using the trust that you have in that individual, share something that is false, but you do so unintentionally. What we're going to focus more on is this idea of disinformation. So disinformation is the idea that there are things that are deliberately created to mislead. And so there are these 7 different types. We're not going to go through every single one of them, but I do want to just highlight some examples of how they blur genres between satire and news, and they do so by taking advantage of the conventions of news. So there are different types: satire, parody, false connection, misleading content, false context, imposter content, manipulated content, all the way to purely fabricated content. There are different types, and there's also not to suggest that one thing can't do all of these. It is entirely possible that a fabricated content can also provide false context, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But these are helpful ways of thinking about the various types of disinformation. So let's take a quick look. So we're all familiar with The Onion, right? We all know that The Onion is out there. There's a whole bunch of satire parody websites. Sometimes they fool people, but the way that satire and parody works is by knowingly and winkingly using those conventions, twisting them, and using them for humorous ends, right? But the joke only works if you understand what and how The Onion is doing its work. much of the humor is in how this particular site covers the news, right? It does so, but it does so in a very sort of humorous, satirical fashion. Next slide. This idea of false context. Now, this is a tweet, but tweets and memes are often passed for news these days. And what you have here is this idea of false context. And in false context, you can have this thing saying it's one thing and the image being something else. So this is a good example. This was a tweet saying that this was a rally in Phoenix, Arizona. Turns out that's not Phoenix, that's Cleveland. And that is 2016 when the Cavs won the NBA championship. So what this does is much of what news does is making sure that information is understood in context, dates, sourcing, corroboration, verification, right? All of those things are about understanding how things are placed in context. But what this does is it completely voids and misappropriates an image and ties it to a description that is completely and totally false. Go to the next one. This is, maybe you've run into this, you've seen it in the Sunday paper, advertising your Amish-made fireplaces that looks like a news story, or there was a couple of years ago when the Amazon Prime show Man in the High Castle had a ad that mirrored as a Time magazine cover. This is another good example. Native advertising uses news to try and facilitate the acceptance of this idea as a means of selling a particular thing. And you see this happening in a lot of different ways. A good example is, if you remember the Plandemic video from last year about the conspiracy theories behind a lot of what was happening with COVID and vaccines and things like that. Very slickly produced documentary. It was designed intentionally to look like a documentary. Or two, this idea of there's a lot of in the chemtrail conspiracies that that governments are seeding the atmosphere with the means of creating weather. What you often find is that those types of efforts are adopt a pseudoscientific sounding type language and a pseudoscientific type packaging in order to facilitate the kinds of discussions that they want, or muddying the water about, oh, you think you understand the science? Maybe you don't. So there's this idea of poster content that happens as well. And then there's the purely fabricated content that is the fake news that we talk about, but all that does is it just takes something, creates it out of whole cloth, violating every intention, integrity of ethical journalism, but doing so using the conventions of news for the purpose of sort of bypassing that sort of credibility gap. It looks like news, therefore it must be. And so you get a lot of this, but all of these things are designed in such a way to take advantage of the way people may read them and perceive them. An audience may read and perceive them. So let's go back quickly to the, where does the time go? Good heavens. Yeah, that was the slide from earlier. Accidentally. It's all right, no worries. It was just accidentally in the wrong place. But let's go back to the Padlet and just quickly look at how InfoWars did a number of these things, right? So you can see a lot of you have said it, citing news sources. Now, one of the things too, and this is again the problem of the way the checklists look at it, it quotes accepted news sources. That might, if we ask that question, it's doing that thing, but it's not doing so in a way.
Sorry.
That's okay. It's not doing so in a way that excuse me, that is in comportment with sort of news. So citing, very official looking date. It is dated. I will tell you, if you're familiar with the idea of the supermoon, it's that the moon once a month is a giant death orb, hanging over our heads, threatening to kill us all by creating earthquakes, right? It's this idea that when it's closest to the earth, it causes all of these issues. So the date does matter. It borrows the sort of pyramidal structure of the how it goes about doing things. It looks kind of professional, right? It does all of the things in many ways, even advertisements. See, some of you said things like that. And many of these things it is doing to sort of bypass or at least adopt the process of news, to really package it in a way that people are familiar with and understand in order to achieve the purpose, which is the perpetuation of an idea. In InfoWars' case, it's a way of sort of furthering these ideas that the mainstream media tends to ignore. And they ignore them because they fall outside of what is considered real. But it's doing all of these things, choosing these things very intentionally to achieve that end. And so this sort of leads us into the final part of our presentation. It is we can teach people how to sort of analyze the information in this way, to look for these markers, to understand the process of the way news is created. But there are a whole slew of cognitive biases that get in the way of simply getting in front of a class, getting in front of someone, if you're working in a public library, and telling them, oh, you should be looking for these markers of high quality journalism, high quality information, and then asking them to go out and do that. There are a slew of cognitive biases that get in the way of doing that. And If I Apply is designed to try to get a sense of how the biases that I hold may influence the way that we interact with the information that we evaluate.
So I've seen a couple of the comments that have come through chat, and I agree with the comments that have come through. Even calling it fake news by people debunking it undermines credibility of news itself. Lies are lies and fraud is fraud. Fake news is an oxymoron. It's a phrase we should have never started using in the first place. So that leads into my kind of final section of this before we lead into our last activity, in looking at bias and looking at confirmation and cognitive biases and how that impacts the work that we do and the research that we look for, the information that we look for as we're doing research, excuse me. And when I teach class, when I interact with people, I actually don't use the phrase fake news. I have a lot of issues with the phrase itself. I think the phrase itself can divide a room just by using it, because of the connotation implied by the phrase, because of the buzzworthy, the buzzword history of the phrase. So I actually don't say fake news at all. I tend to say misinformation and disinformation.
Can I just say one thing too?
Yeah.
I apologize. We apologize for the clickbaity nature of the title of our thing, because we did it on purpose. Said fake news, knowing full well that we talk about larger misinformation and disinformation campaigns, but we did it because it got people's attention. Right. So sorry,
but we're not sorry.
Yeah, we're not sorry.
Sorry, because that is the point, right? That is the point of information in general, and just the social and viral nature of information, and how that is really plays into our own confirmation biases, especially. So that's what If I Apply really seeks to do, is to address confirmation bias and cognitive bias. So if we think about confirmation bias from a perspective of why is someone looking for information? What impact is this information having on them? So if they're a student that's been assigned a topic, let's kind of go from one end of the spectrum to another. And also understanding that there are a ton of gray area in between. But a student is assigned a topic, they don't pick a topic themselves, they're assigned a topic in class that maybe they're not super jazzed about, they're not really interested in. Do you think that maybe a lot of confirmation bias will go into how they research that topic or how they look for information? Maybe, maybe not. I think that this is where the sliding scale could start moving more towards confirmation bias. So let's say that there's a topic that they know very little about or don't really care about, and then they read something that is maybe a misinformative or disinformative piece, and then that sets the baseline for them, right, to then move forward and start seeking more information. And that is, you know, that plays into that. But then if we look at it kind of from the other end of the spectrum, that this is now a topic that a person is looking for information because they feel very deeply about the topic, whether it's for personal reasons, research reasons, it's a thesis, you know, they've written a hypothesis, or they're doing research that would impact the health of their child or a family member, right? There are lots of different reasons that confirmation bias and cognitive biases affect and impact how people look for information. So if we can take vaccines as an example, I know one of the questions that we got in our questions, I have them pulled up here on my phone because I can only have so many things on my screen all at once. But one of the questions that we got, how do you handle health-related misinformation? And I think part of that really does play into how you even seek to look for the information. What keywords are you using specifically to find the information? So if we take vaccinations, for example, I think that's a pretty solid hot topic that has lots of information out there that covers just a broad spectrum of stances on vaccinations. And these can be vaccinations, right? And then across the board, like there's so many subgenres of vaccines. So if you type in your keywords, which is how you're going to establish what information you pull back. If you type vaccine, vaccine's pretty unbiased. It's pretty straightforward. A vaccine is a vaccine. If you do a Google Images search of the word vaccine, you get a lot of stock photography, lots of blues, lots of calming. You don't actually see children's faces when you look at these images. So, you know, but then if you type anti-vaxxer, which is a pretty strongly biased keyword or vocabulary, you're going to find lots of satirical cartoons. You're going to find a lot of pictures of people protesting, either, you know, for vaccines or, you know, protesting against vaccination, right? Those are the types of, you know, things that are going to come up. A lot of them will be news, a lot of them will be tweets, things like that. And then if you type in to kind of have a differing perspective, type in vaccine injury. Again, these images are going to be now of children's faces facing forward. So you see a lot of side-by-side images of a happy child versus a child who's crying or a child who's in the hospital. The assumption is made the child went from version A to version B because they received a vaccine and had an adverse reaction. And a lot of these images that come in are also now of things like infographics, things like consumer health materials. So how does one assess that information if they don't have all of the information at hand? So part of that is really making sure that the way you approach a topic is as unbiased as possible. And that's really hard to do. But that is where If I Apply comes in. So If I Apply tries to look at information from the personal perspective and then leading into the assessment of the information once you have sought it out. So the goal is to address those cognitive biases. And the first question that we ask people when they start to use the If I Apply tool is really to sit down. I have colleagues that if they have time, you know, I know that this isn't necessarily feasible for everybody, but an example of this would be to have students, if you're teaching people, to do a free write about their topic that's persuasive, to say, okay, I want to know and I want you to understand how you really feel about this. So you're going to take 5 or 10 minutes to persuade someone why your stance is the best stance, right? Or why. And that really helps kind of couch where their honest opinions are regarding the topic. It can look at the history of why they feel this way. You know, but why, what are your emotions surrounding this? Of, I don't know, I know nothing about this. Okay, great. Or, you know, like, I'm really interested in looking at alternative therapies for cancer treatment because, you know, my mom is about to go through her 3rd round of radiation chemotherapy and it is just really hard to be there. And that's so personal. That's so feeling. So we can look at this from a health information perspective. We can look at this from a lot of different perspectives. And then another question we got was the F in if. Where do we find unbiased sources? When we look for unbiased sources, I think that's going to depend on two things. It's going to depend on what people have access to, whether they have access to databases or if they just have access to the internet and no databases. I would say if you have access to resources like opposing viewpoints, I'm not saying that opposing viewpoints is the best thing in the entire world. They have done a lot of work. 10 years ago, when I started working as an academic librarian, opposing viewpoints used to use terminology like they would have the topic and then they would have pros and cons. That language itself is very biased. That says that opposing viewpoints sits on the side of the pros and then disagrees with the side of the cons when they're looking at a topic. And now they just look at varying viewpoints. They say like viewpoint A or viewpoint B, however they terminate, whatever terminology they use. So that's one suggestion. Another suggestion, going back to what Joel said, looking at places like Wikipedia or encyclopedias. I think that there is always going to be bias in resources that we're looking at. There's always going to be flaws in the places that we look for information. Wikipedia quite clearly has issues with gender bias, racial bias, lots of different bias, but I think that it is still, if you don't have access to a specific database, it's not a bad place to go. Facts on file, thank you very much. Issues and controversies, yes, Wendy, that's another place that you can go. You can do a Google search for reading lists. Now, again, this has to be a reading list that then you take a look at. But again, it's hard, but you have to force yourself to try and find something that's unbiased. You have to force yourself to go outside and not just find information that confirms what you're looking for. Can I
just add one thing? I mean, not to push the answer to this question off, this is something that we are currently working on.
Mm-hmm.
We are trying to understand bias as an idea, and we're still trying to figure out this idea of what is bias, neutrality, objectivity, and it's turning out to be a really difficult question to answer. So all of these things, I mean, everything Kat has suggested, I think is useful, but oftentimes it's you have to think about what type of bias we're talking about. There isn't just, not everything is a partisan bias or an ideologically motivated bias. And it's not all presented in the same way in a source. So it's a complicated question. But opposing viewpoints is a good push because at least you can see competing perspectives and where they converge and where they diverge and where the baseline might be and things like that. So sorry.
No, that's thank you. And then I think that the final step of the FI portion is to really look at having the intellectual courage to seek other authoritative voices. So again, this is really making sure that you step outside of your own comfort zone and you encourage others to then step outside of their comfort zone. What is the best way to respond to patrons who say that they do not trust the media, as we're looking at this from a media perspective? Say, okay, well, what do you trust? And don't you think it's important to try and find all of the information so you can make the most well-rounded decision? Because if you only hear the same thing all the time, that's only looking at one perspective. This is the same thing that you can do with friends and family. You can say, well, where's the evidence? What's the evidence? What do other people say about this? What makes you uncomfortable, right? So thinking of, how to teach students valid info on really controversial topics, which can be things like the Holocaust. That can be a controversial topic. Things like race. If we look at it from a broader perspective, I'm reading some of the comments that are coming in the chat. So, I think that you have to really look at yourself and look at your own emotions and how you identify with a topic and how you feel about something so that you can say, okay, what makes me angry? what makes me upset, what makes me uncomfortable, what do I maybe not know, and start looking for that information. And then it gets into the assessment piece. So, you know, the assessment piece really is similar to other assessment pieces. It's nothing like brand new. But again, it is couched, the If I Apply tool does really look at this from, you know, what bias could be involved in the creation of this piece. And the one part I'm going to focus on for the purpose of today, out of all of this, is authority. So I'm seeing this a lot, especially working with allied health and health sciences. Authority can be used in a misinformation, disinformation advantage, right? So we look at this from the perspective of like white coat syndrome. Like someone walks in a lab coat or someone walks in a white coat and you're like, yep, I'm gonna trust what they say to me because they are this authoritative figure. And you know, misinformation, disinformation uses authority to their advantage. Anybody can say that they are a doctor. Anybody can say that they have a PhD, MD, DO, DNP, right? Like all of these different titles. But does someone legitimately having, you know, the title of doctor and holding some sort of degree, give them carte blanche to talk about anything and everything, right? If you're in the medical profession, if you are an MD, do you have the authority to talk about every single topic within health, within medicine? Or, right, Dr. Phil, thank you, Russ, right? Does that mean that you're an expert on all of these things? Or does that mean you're an expert maybe on specific things? And how does that impact what people are reading and what people are seeing? So, you know, I think that what we've done then is also create some critical thinking questions that go along with If I Apply. So we don't expect people to answer these questions, right? Like these questions aren't there to say, you know, oh, you have to answer this laundry list of questions, because nobody wants to do that. But they're really to help you kickstart and say, oh, you know, what do I need to do to do the personal steps, and what do I need to do to really apply the source evaluation steps, and how do I look for bias, and how do I seek my own bias, and what are some important things that I should attempt to do. And I think, again, in bold on this slide, the most important thing, which is probably one of the hardest things to do, is to reject unsound arguments and to have the courage to accept that not all viewpoints are valid, including your own, or including another person that you really respect, or a figure that you respect. No one is infallible, nobody is perfect. I think that is a really important thing to recognize. And it's very hard for people to say, wow, I was wrong. Like I was really wrong about that. You know, I'm gonna change my stance because I have looked for this other information. My last point before we kick off into our final activity, which we're going to have a little less time for because we want to take some more questions. It's really great conversation happening in chat as well. But Wendy, I have information I'll share with you after the fact. But I think that what we need to remember to do as we talk about bias is that we need to assess every single thing that we come across at the same level. So if it is something, going back to vaccines and how I feel about vaccines, and having to take myself out of my comfort zone and look at other information that's coming in, and I say, okay, I found this article, I found this blog post, I found this expert, whatever it is that I find, you know, I need to assess that, not to debunk it. I need to assess it just at value, to assess it and see if it is a credible and reliable resource or not. So I think that again is very hard to do, because if we say I'm not going to cherry pick evidence, I'm not going to, you know, only use certain things. I'm actually going to reject things that are out there. If you go out with the idea that you're going to reject it because it doesn't sit, that is, you're confirming your own biases, even though you say you've looked at something, if you look at it specifically with the viewpoint to get rid of it. So our last thing that we're going to bring up is Food Babe. So we have a couple of questions here on this slide, as you can see. You know, how could cognitive or confirmation biases factor into the evaluation of a blog post? So does something, you know, Is it more or less reliable because it is a blog post? I put that very specific language in this question. You know, if it's a blog post, a tweet, you know, etc., what does that mean? And have you heard of Food Babe? I see a couple people are chiming in. I see some very opinionated responses to this already. So if you are familiar with Food Babe, Joel just dropped the Padlet in. We're not using that yet, but think to yourself, you know, what reaction did you have when you heard that, when we put that up on the slide, or you heard me say it? Are you like, yeah, Food Babe? I've read, you know, some of her work. I've listened to her research and her theories. Oh yeah, Food Babe. Oh, forgot about that, right? So I'm seeing some of that come through. So just think about that for a moment as you do this. And I'm about to. Then Joel, you can go ahead and drop in the Food Babe blog post.
It is there. It's there.
Oh, beautiful.
I dropped it in. Yeah, it may have to scroll up a little bit.
That's fine. So Joel dropped in. So this is where you're gonna. This is and then right. If you haven't heard of Food Babe before, what does that title of this person really evoke? What emotions does that evoke in you? So we're going to have you go ahead and open this. These hired experts are infiltrating the media to confuse you about food. You're going to open this. You're going to have about 3 minutes. You're going to have about 3 minutes to read and answer the questions in the Padlet. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to open the Padlet page so we can kind of talk about those responses as they come in. You know, but, you know, we have 2 yes/no questions that if you wanted to put a sentence to say why or why not, how or how not. Do you believe authority or authorities are present in this blog post? And is the information authentic and complete? And then going back to the genre blurring, you know, what news-like elements exist in this blog post? So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to pull up the Padlet so we can watch those answers come in. And then if you wanted to start posting some questions in the chat, we'd be happy to start answering those as well while we can kind of do, you know, we can multitask as we're here. And yes, thank you very much for posting the information in there, Barbara. We appreciate it. All right. So Food Babe or Fear Babe? Okay. Let me see these starting to come in. So Kim is saying, I don't know Food Babe, but the name isn't getting me to be real excited about this.
She is the person who helped get rid of the pink slime in
yes.
in McDonald's hamburgers.
Yes. And if you've heard of Subway taking the yoga mat chemical out of their bread, or the whatever the additive was, that was her as well. Yes, yoga mat bread. Yes. Yep. Thank you.
So I see a lot of people are like extremely personal, opinionated rhetoric. I think that is very true. Mm-hmm. The issue though at play here is if someone is out there and is believing that you know, organic, natural food is the way to go, that we should have no chemicals whatsoever in any of our food, this becomes a very sort of persuasive argument, right? It's easy for us, and I'm not saying this bias is wrong. I want to be clear about that. I'm not saying that, but it's easier for us to look at this and say, well, it doesn't have what you would say academic evidence to support it. But she does cite her stuff, right? Mm-hmm. There are links to other places. She presents it in a sort of a very official. Yes, it's a blog, but it is a blog that is not terribly dissimilar to other blogs on the New York. You know what I mean? Like it's New York Times or other journalistic blogs. The issue is that we are approaching it from sort of an academic evidence standpoint, and that sort of taints the way that we are evaluating it. Mm-hmm. Think about it from the perspective of someone who doesn't have that baseline.
Right. And yes, Barbara, I saw that you said Fear Babe is a book. It was a book that was authored in direct response to the Food Babe blog.
Yeah.
It is a group of, oh gosh, I can't remember who all the different people are now. I'm so sorry, but there are like technology, communications, definitely health experts. You know, other experts are brought in, and they really talk about Food Babe as the person, and then as the information that's being put out.
Yep.
Right. So it's a label for a specific person, and the e-girl style label, female content creators. That is an interesting response. I had not thought of that, but thank you for sharing that, Elizabeth. Yeah, that is a really, really interesting knee-jerk response as well. Thank you for sharing that. So I see these are rolling in. Scare tactics to select information to try to prove points. I think that's definitely something that's addressed frequently when people talk about her different articles, her different posts. Format is similar to other types of legitimate blogs. So I think we're going to see some overlap between places like Food Babe and places like Goop. I think that this is a good example of an influencer who's not necessarily a celebrity, but has definitely made a name for herself. Gwyneth Paltrow was already a name before, right? She was already a celebrity, well known before Goop came out, you know, but I think that this has a similar effect, similar effect. So, one of the questions that we got that I think we addressed somewhat is it safe to assume that media is always skewed to one side or another?
It's me, isn't it?
This is for Joel to answer. To one side or agenda or another. If that is the case, then isn't it prudent to listen to all sides and estimate a middle ground as the truth? Yes. That is the hope with if I apply. Oh, I think we might have lost Joel. He looks pretty frozen. I hope it's not just me. Oh, there he is. He's back. But muted. There you go.
My internet connection is unstable.
That's good.
I'm being informed.
Left.
Sorry, go ahead.
Right. So the question is it somewhat safe to assume that media is always skewed to one side or agenda or another? If that is the case, then isn't it prudent to listen to all sides and estimate a middle ground as the truth?
So if I can answer that question.
Please.
It depends on how it's biased. I will say this, that there are structural biases that limit how a story can be told, right? 60 seconds, sound bites, editing. There are biases that limit how a story can be told. If those biases are perpetuated by some kind of ideology, then that becomes problematic. The issue that has plagued many people who've researched media bias is what constitutes balance. Because balance may differ depending on what issues are. So in terms of climate change, what is balance? And do you provide all opportunities for people who hold, say, racist views, equal time and opportunity to share those via the media? So balance isn't necessarily easy to define. And what makes it really hard too is just actually figuring out whether or not that anything is motivated by pure partisanship. In terms of just sort of your regular run-of-the-mill news. I'm not talking about opinion or punditry. Those things exist primarily for individuals who may have credentials, who may not, to perpetuate their own opinions in ways that don't have to necessarily follow the guidelines put forth by journalism. So in answer to that question, I think it's complicated listening to all sides, because not all sides deserve equal hearing. And just because there's an imbalance doesn't necessarily mean that bias is bad. This is where we currently are in this article that we're working on. It's just bias. The idea, the concept is a lot more complicated than this idea that we can just easily spot it or understand it via some kind of imbalanced presentation in the way the information is provided. I don't know if that answered the question.
Joel,
but I would
and
also say,
Kat,
but I'd also say there's a difference between everything being biased, being told from a limited perspective, and everything being biased in a negative, prejudiced, distorted, misrepresentational way. There's a difference between those two things, and that telling those things, the difference between those two things can be difficult.
Yes, and it is noon.
I know, sorry.
yes. Thank you. So folks, in the interest of respecting everyone's time, I am going to bring the session to a close. We'd like to thank everyone for joining us today, and Kat and Joel, thank you for presenting for us. I hope everyone will take a few moments to complete our survey. Let us know your thoughts about the presentation today and our programming in general. The link for the survey is in the links area at the bottom of the presentation screen. As a reminder, the recording of this presentation will be available to PALA members early next week through the PALA website. If you're not a PALA member and you're interested in becoming a member, please feel free to email me and I'll have the appropriate person contact you. You can also get in touch with us regarding your suggestions for future discussions and presentations, and definitely invite one of us if you would like to, or contact one of us if you would like to present. Have a wonderful day.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. I need to perfect my queen wave, my post Zoom.